Peace, family. This is the Drapetomaniac Podcast, and I'm Ayapo Yapa, the HDIC. That's the head Drapetomaniac in charge. And we're here to have conversations on how to get off this plantation. Stokely Carmichael said speaking of Dr. King, major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He made only one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. That philosophy is also my philosophy. I have read and heard about nonviolence my entire life, and we as a collective have adhered for the most part to that mantra, as well as having white people pull Dr. King out of their pockets to use on us whenever they know.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that you listeners are listening to the Drapetomaniac Podcast on doayamedia.com. You are, right?
We're seeing through their BS, and they're feeling threatened. After decades of nonviolent protests, I would like to ask our people, how's that working out for us? James Baldwin said, "What is it you want me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You also told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's time, and my sister's time. How much time do you want for your progress?" How much indeed? We march, we protest, we even in some cases speak out before Congress or inside the White House. The problem with that process goes back to the statement made by Carmichael. He said it one way, I say it this way. Who are you talking to? We are all seeing the protest, the chaos, and the fact that America is literally being burned down to the ground. And we see protests and marches globally that were sparked by the slow, torturous murder of unarmed black man, George Floyd. One of the dangers we run is to make Derek Chauvin, the murderer who murdered George Floyd, the center of the more global discussion. In this particular case, it is indeed all about the murder and the accessories to the murder who facilitated the killing of George Floyd when looked at specifically. But as the lens widens and the situation is addressed globally, the protests and quote-unquote riots that are taking place are about far more than the indiscriminate murder of yet another unarmed black person in the United States. The question has to be asked, why did this not happen with the murders of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, and countless others? The question becomes, should any human being have to live within an environment in which they're emerging dead or physically or psychologically harmed from an interaction with police be the luck of the draw, as it is with black people in this country? As I watch the story unfold, it's becoming apparent that the narrative at some point is going to pivot to one of rights, liberty, and justice for all people. I'm already hearing about the fact that the United States was already a powder keg, just waiting for something to light the fuse. The murder of George Floyd lit that fuse. But now that the other 3 cops have been charged and Chauvin's charge has been upgraded to second-degree murder, will that be enough to placate black people and lull us back into a belief that this country is actually listening to us and desiring to do the right thing? I worked in customer service at a company for about 7 years at one time in my life. In that 7 years, I dealt with in excess of 40,000 people, if you can imagine that. So I feel I'm qualified to say what I'm about to say. Having personally had one-on-one interactions with over 40,000 people, I discovered something that was deeply disturbing. For me to illustrate this, I'll have to give you a typical scenario. And if I needed to put a percentage to it, I would say about 90% of the time, this is how it would go. A customer would ask about something having to do with an order. Say the order's coming late. I would look up the order and let the customer know exactly what was going on with it. Say for the sake of example that I explained to the customer that the item would not be arriving for another week or two. Almost every time the customer would get angry and demand that we get it to them faster. After spending 10 to 15 minutes trying to get them to understand that there's nothing that we can do at that point because it's in the hands of whatever delivery service we used, I would finally tell them that they will receive it within 2 or 3 days. Now keep in mind that I just spent over 10 minutes trying to give them good, right information. When I would tell them 2 to 3 days, for no real reason other than I wanted to get them off the phone, something always happened to this day that I cannot believe. The customer would then calm down and basically say, okay, but if it's not here in 2 or 3 days, I'm going to call back. And of course, I would hope and pray that I wouldn't be the one to get that call. And before you start thinking too badly of me, the point I'm making is that me and other service reps always, if they're any good at all, give good information and keep repeating it. But the only way to calm the customer down many times would be to tell them what they want to hear. And I submit that they knew we were only telling them what they wanted to hear because they wanted to hear it. And they knew that it was a lie. But since it is what they wanted to hear, that is what they would accept instead of the truth that you spent 10 to 15 minutes constantly giving them. They just didn't want it. I said all that to say our people, in my opinion, suffer from that unfortunate condition. This country has spent not months, not years, not decades, but centuries telling us exactly what they think of our people and how it feels about us, and taking every possible opportunity to show us the absolute malice and contempt it feels toward us. But we refuse to accept that, and so we march, we protest, we yell, kick, scream, pray, speak loudly, speak softly, shake our signs, sit in, act non-violently. And eventually the country says, okay, we'll treat you right, and we'll do everything we can to educate white citizens and the power structure to do right by your people. And then we say, good, thank you. But keep in mind, the next time you gun another one of us down in the street or in our own home, we're going to go right back out there and march and protest again. And of course, the violence and terror happens again. And quiet as it's kept, it never stopped. We just get another graphic view of it by a cell phone that happened to be present at the time. And the cycle starts all over again. As we watch the march and protests and see the oceans of white faces chanting, holding up signs that say Black Lives Matter and no justice, no peace, we need to see it for what it is. It is that, baby, I'm sorry I'll never hit you again, as he hands her flowers and candy and takes her out for dinner moment. If we accept, and sadly, I have zero doubt that we won't, things calm down for a little while, but in a few days or weeks or even months, another unarmed and or innocent black person will be brutally murdered by a uniformed or non-uniformed race soldier, and the cycle will obscenely start again. I said in another podcast that when you're dealing with the elected officials and people in positions of power, you literally might as well be talking to a mannequin. And I painstakingly broke down why. I don't know how much more plainly I could have put it. For some reason, and I actually know the answer, our people think that the opponent we're dealing with has some kind of a conscience or some form of humanity within them, instead of being the morally bankrupt, depraved to the point of being human in form only, speaking of being humanoid, entities who actually have less in common with you than you do with a rock. I'm actually looking for new language to refer to them, because based upon their actions, I find it difficult to believe that they're actually human. They may be humanoid, but throughout their history, far past to present, they do not seem to fall into the category of human. Do deep research on tools of torture, weapons of mass destruction, and techniques of terror throughout their history, and you tell me if they exhibit any characteristic, even remotely, of being human beings. As a people, I'm not talking about individual persons. I mean as a group. What human being enslaves another and then subjects them to the most degrading, non-stop torture and brutality their minds can conceive and think little or nothing of it? What human being straps a 14-year-old child into the electric chair, speaking of George Stinney, and sends thousands of volts of electricity through them for a couple murders they knew that child didn't commit? That child. What human being beats a child to death, speaking of Emmett Till, for nothing? What human being jokes about hunting and killing other human beings and then goes out and does it? What human being drags a man behind a truck because of his skin color? What human being throws babies to alligators and jokes about it? What human beings torture, murder, and lynch people and have gatherings for it and treat it as a celebration, making souvenir postcards of it and fighting over charred body parts as a trophy? What human being creates systems in which a few at the top have enough resources to take care of everybody in the entire world and then watch untold suffering of billions of people they know it's in their power to alleviate, but instead not only ignore it, but actively work to perpetuate it? What human being kills an ocean, irradiates and kills an entire planet, and for money cares nothing about it, as long as they're getting paid? And once again, reflect on the words of Stokely Carmichael. Nonviolence, and I want to add reason and appeals to compassion, only works if your opponent has a conscience. So, why are we so easily duped time after unending time? Because for some inexplicable reason, which likely has to do with the conditioning and grooming of our people, we are desperate for white acceptance. We want to be part of them. We want to be recognized and have access to the American dream. So when they fake any kind of concern or desire for understanding and or solidarity for and with our people, we quickly grab hold of it and clasp it like a vice every time. Like a battered woman who wants and needs her significant other so desperately that a day after the worst beating he ever gave her, she tells him what an animal and monster he is, and all the while hopelessly, desperately in sick love with him. He brings her flowers and candy and begs forgiveness for the 100th time, and how much he needs her, appreciates her, and will go to AA, rehab, detox, all at the same time, blah, 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 blah. And she takes him back and says, "If you don't change this time, I'm leaving." And she means it, just as she meant it the 100 times before when she said exactly the same thing. Things run smoothly for a while, and then boom, it happens again, and it just becomes the same thing, different day. Why are all these white people marching, protesting, carrying signs, and in some cases rioting? Is it because of George Floyd and the injustices done to black people? Don't be fooled. We got hit with a fake pandemic that forced everyone indoors, out of jobs, losing possessions, homes, ability to buy food, and so on. And the government very visibly did absolutely nothing. Instead, they executed the largest wealth transfer from bottom to top in the history of mankind and threw everyone else a few pennies to keep them quiet. The government screwed everyone who was not wealthy, and white people know it. So for perhaps the first time in American history, the government showed in no unambiguous terms the naked reality of what black people had always known, that this government doesn't give a damn about the people. And white people were fine with that, as long as they thought it was only happening to black people. But now that they see that in the eyes of the quote-unquote power elite, if you aren't one of them, then we're all equally worthless. The privilege that they so vehemently deny that they even have was snatched away from them, and they are confused and enraged by it. And so now they're out marching and protesting and rioting, but not because of injustices done to black people. That's fine to them. Ironically, everything that they're doing right now under the guise of anger and indignation because of injustices done to black people is actually because of what they feel are injustices done to white people. And that irony is not lost on me. And we need not fall for the superficial crocodile tears, candy, flowers, and apologies. For them, it's not about George Floyd or us. If it was, these same crowds would have gathered for Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, and so on. They are angry not for our sake, but for theirs. And if suddenly everything could go back to the status quo, and they have their jobs, they have their homes, cars, food in the refrigerator, ability to run out to the movies anytime that they want to, trust and believe. As our people continue to be brutalized, terrorized, and murdered, the crowds of white faces would most certainly thin out. When will we ever wise up and seek to separate? Thank you for listening to the Draped and Maniac podcast. This is Ayapo Yapa, the HDIC, that is the head drapetomaniac in charge. I'll meet you here again next Friday on doayamedia.com, and until then, I'll see you on the run.
And thank you again for listening to the Drapetomaniac podcast. Tune in next week at doayamedia.com. DOEAIAMEDIA.com. And again, we'll catch you on the run. Peace.